The shuttle door hissed open, and a wave of fresh recruits stepped onto the training grounds of the Interstellar Combat Training Center. Towering steel walls surrounded them, lined with turrets and watchful drone sentries. Beyond the perimeter, massive war machines stood in formation. Titan mechs, exosuits, and high-tech weaponry gleamed under the artificial sun. The air smelled of metal, fuel, and ozone. Ethan Carter adjusted the strap of his bag and took his first step onto the Academy soil. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now, standing among aliens of all shapes and sizes, reality set in. He was the only human recruit. A whisper ran through the crowd. Some tried to be discreet, others made no effort to hide their amusement. A human? Here? Are they serious? A tall insectoid cadet clicked its mandibles, its 4 compound eyes blinking in disbelief. They don't even have claws or armor. A bulky reptilian warrior flexed its scaly arms, shaking its head. A group of avian cadets tilted their heads and exchanged glances. He must be a translator or a technician. No way they'd send something so squishy into combat. Ethan ignored the murmurs. He had expected this. Humans were the newcomers to the galactic stage, barely recognized as a military power. Most of these species had been part of interstellar warfare for centuries, while Earth had only recently joined the alliance. This wasn't going to be easy. A deep, guttural voice boomed across the courtyard, silencing the chatter. "Attention, recruits!" The speaker was Commander Rix, a towering Draxus war veteran. His deep green scales glistened under the Academy lights, and his golden eyes scanned the crowd like a predator sizing up its prey. Scars lined his snout and arms, testament to decades of battle experience. He moved with the weight of authority, his armored boots thudding against the ground as he inspected the new batch. "You stand before the most elite combat training facility in the galaxy," Rix growled. "Here, you will be broken down and reforged into weapons of war. Some of you will not make it. Some of you will beg to leave." He bared his sharp teeth in what could only be described as a cruel smile. "But those who endure will become legends." Ethan felt the pressure of 100 alien eyes shifting toward him as Rix's gaze stopped on him. The reptilian commander narrowed his eyes and let out a slow, deep hiss. "A human?" Rix's voice dripped with disbelief. He turned toward the nearest instructor, an armored feline-like officer. "Is this a mistake?" "No, sir," the instructor replied. "Earth was granted 1 seat in this year's training cycle." Rix exhaled sharply. 1 seat? The Council wastes a slot on a species that only recently figured out how to leave their own atmosphere? A few chuckles rippled through the cadets. Ethan clenched his jaw but remained silent. He had been warned that respect had to be earned here, not given. Rix took a step closer, towering over him. "Tell me, human, do you even understand what this training entails? You're standing among warriors who have fought in planetary invasions, siege warfare, zero-gravity combat. What battles have you fought? What victories can your kind claim?" Ethan looked up at him, determined not to show weakness. He had read about this kind of hazing, how alien species dismissed humans as weak. He had rehearsed responses, but in this moment, all he could do was meet Rix's glare with unwavering resolve. "We may not have fought your wars," Ethan said evenly, his voice steady, "but we fought our own, and we don't break as easily as you think." Some cadets scoffed. A few looked intrigued. Rix, however, only chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that held no warmth. "We'll see," he said, stepping back. "If you last the first week." Ethan's fists tightened at his sides, but he didn't react. This was just the beginning. Rix turned back to the group. "Your training starts now. Welcome to hell, recruits." The training arena buzzed with energy as recruits gathered in a wide combat pit. The ground was hard-packed metal, designed to withstand the intense training that took place daily. Around the edges, a group of alien cadets whispered amongst themselves, excitement and curiosity filling the air. Everyone knew what was coming. Hand-to-hand combat training. Commander Rix stood in the center, his scaled arms crossed over his chest. His golden eyes scanned the recruits before him, his gaze filled with challenge and expectation. "Combat is not just about strength," he growled, his deep voice carrying across the arena. "It's about skill, control, and understanding your opponent. He paused, looking over the group with clear amusement. And today, we will see just how much skill our newest recruits truly have. A murmur passed through the crowd. Some were eager to prove themselves, others wary of the challenge ahead. Rix motioned for the first pair to step forward. Ethan took a breath as his name was called. The moment he had been waiting for had arrived. As he stepped into the pit, his opponent followed. A massive, four-armed Bracarian cadet named Duroc. The Bracarian was covered in thick, stone-like skin, his muscled frame towering over Ethan. A grin spread across his tusked face as he cracked his massive knuckles. A wave of laughter rippled through the audience. "They're making the human fight Duroc?" one alien whispered, shaking its head. "That's not a match. That's a funeral." Ethan ignored them. He didn't expect an easy fight. He had seen the training footage of Bracarians, how they relied on brute strength, how they smashed through opponents like they were made of paper. If he tried to fight Duroc head-on, he wouldn't last more than a second. Rix raised a clawed hand. "Begin!" Duroc wasted no time. He charged forward, his forearms ready to grab and crush. Ethan sidestepped, barely dodging the first blow. Fast, powerful. The impact of Duroc's missed strike sent a deep vibration through the metal floor. The crowd murmured as Ethan danced out of range. Light on his feet, his eyes scanning for an opening. Duroc snarled, shifting his weight, his massive frame surprisingly agile for its size. He lunged again, sweeping low with one set of arms while the other stayed raised, anticipating Ethan's next move. Ethan didn't hesitate. Instead of retreating, he moved forward, ducking under the Bracarian's massive upper limbs and striking at his exposed ribs. The impact did little against Duroc's thick skin, but the move surprised him. Duroc grunted, stumbling slightly as Ethan twisted away, slipping behind him before the Bracarian could recover. The crowd gasped. "He dodged it," someone muttered. Duroc growled, frustration creeping into his expression. He turned, this time more cautious. He had expected to win immediately, but now he was forced to think. Ethan stayed focused. He couldn't outmatch Duroc in strength, but he could outthink him. The Bracarian rushed in again, this time more controlled, less reckless. Ethan waited until the last possible moment before dropping low and sweeping his opponent's leg. The move caught Duroc off guard, forcing his weight forward. As the massive alien stumbled, Ethan sprang up, using his momentum to drive an elbow into the back of Duroc's knee. With a loud crash, the Bracarian hit the ground. Silence. The recruits stared in shock. He actually took him down?" Duroc grunted, looking up in disbelief. His forearms clenched into fists as if he wanted to keep fighting, but Rix raised a hand. "Enough!" Ethan stepped back, his breathing steady. His heart pounded, adrenaline rushing through his veins. He had done it. He had proved that humans weren't weak. Rix studied him for a long moment, then simply nodded. "Not bad, human." The fight had lasted barely a minute, but the shift in the air was undeniable. Ethan had earned their attention. The recruits gathered in the next hall for weapons training. A long row of advanced firearms and energy-based weapons lined the walls. Plasma rifles, kinetic pistols, railguns, each one designed for precision, power, and destruction. Instructor Talon, a feline-like alien with sleek, dark fur, paced in front of the recruits. "Marksmanship is a skill that must be mastered," she said. "A soldier who cannot control their weapon is as good as dead." She stopped in front of the first rack of weapons and tapped a compact plasma rifle. "This is a standard-issue energy rifle," Talon continued. "Fires charged plasma rounds. Recoil is manageable, but only if you respect it." One by one, recruits stepped forward, lifting the rifles, adjusting their grips, and taking aim at floating target drones. The first few aliens struggled. The plasma charge was powerful, and the recoil threw them off. Ethan stepped forward next. Talon watched as he lifted the rifle, steady and controlled. He lined up the sights, adjusted for range, and pulled the trigger. The blue plasma bolt streaked across the air, hitting the target dead center. A few cadets glanced at each other. "Lucky shot," one muttered. Ethan fired again. Another perfect hit, then another. Now the murmurs weren't mocking. They were surprised. Talon arched a brow. "You've trained with these before?" Ethan shook his head. Not this exact model, but I know how to shoot. Talon nodded approvingly. Clearly. Rick, standing at the back, watched with narrowed eyes. But the real test was next. A new set of weapons was brought forward. Heavy ordnance. Among them, the Titan railgun. A weapon so large it required either a mounted position or power armor assistance to wield properly. The first few cadets who attempted to fire it nearly fell backward from the sheer force of its recoil. When it was Ethan's turn, Talon smirked. You sure you want to try this, human? Ethan gripped the railgun, bracing his stance. He didn't hesitate. The moment he pulled the trigger, the weapon roared to life, massive kinetic blast firing toward the target at supersonic speed. The shock wave rippled through the training hall. The shot was dead on. Rix blinked. The crowd stared in stunned silence. No one spoke. No one laughed. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Ethan had done something they never expected. The training ground was massive, an artificial battlefield stretching for miles with obstacles, ruined structures, and simulated cover. The recruits were split into teams, each assigned an objective. The rules were simple. Capture and hold the central control point for 5 minutes. Ethan stood with his assigned team, a mix of alien cadets who had been grouped together seemingly at random. He immediately noticed the problem. They were outmatched in physical strength. The other teams had Bracarians, Vortalians, and Rokari, species built for war. Ethan's team, on the other hand, had smaller, more technical species, some with quick reflexes but none with brute power. The opposing team's leader, a towering Rokari named Vesk, smirked from across the field. This will be over quick, he muttered, flexing his claws. The cadets around him laughed, confident in their inevitable victory. As the countdown started, Ethan's mind raced. Brute force wouldn't work. They had to be smarter. All right, listen up, he said to his team. We can't outfight them directly, but we can outthink them. We're faster, smaller, and more adaptable. Let's use that. The others hesitated. Most of them weren't used to taking orders from a human. But as the timer hit 0, Ethan didn't wait for agreement. He moved. Split up! Stick to cover! Don't engage head-on! His team scrambled, moving through the battlefield instead of charging forward like the others. The enemy team pushed aggressively, expecting a direct fight, but found no one there. Ethan and his team had already flanked left, using the ruins to avoid detection. Hold position, Ethan whispered over the comms. His team ducked behind wreckage, watching as the enemy team pushed too far forward. They had overcommitted, leaving their own control point undefended. Now, move in! Ethan's voice was sharp, commanding. His team rushed in from behind, seizing the control point while the enemy was distracted. By the time the opposing team realized what had happened, the timer had already begun counting down in their favor. Vesk snarled in frustration. Take them back! He and his warriors rushed toward Ethan's team, intent on overpowering them with sheer force. Ethan held his ground. Don't engage directly. Keep moving. Keep them off balance. Every time Vesk's squad tried to engage, Ethan's team would reposition, never staying in one spot long enough to be overrun. The enemy grew frustrated, making mistakes. With only 30 seconds left, Vesk lunged straight at Ethan, finally cornering him. Ethan didn't flinch. He sidestepped the attack, using Vesk's momentum against him, forcing the alien to stumble into a wall. Before Vesk could recover, the buzzer rang. Ethan's team had won. The battlefield fell into silence. Vesk stared in disbelief, his claws clenched. His team had been physically superior, yet they had lost. One of Ethan's teammates let out a nervous laugh. We actually did it, another grinned. We did it. The crowd watching from the sidelines muttered among themselves. It had been a flawless execution, something no one had expected from a human. Commander Rix watched from the control tower, his expression unreadable. Interesting, he muttered to himself. Vesk stepped closer, eyes narrowing at Ethan. You got lucky. Ethan shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe you relied too much on brute force. Vesk growled but didn't reply. The rivalry had officially begun. Hours later, the training session had ended, and the cadets were heading back to their barracks when the alarm suddenly blared through the academy. The lights flickered red, and an automated voice echoed across the speakers. Emergency protocol activated, unauthorized breach detected, all personnel secure defensive positions. Confusion spread among the recruits. What's happening? This isn't part of the training exercise, is it? Then the first explosion rocked the outer wall. A deep rumbling followed, and suddenly the sky was filled with streaking energy bolts. From the observation decks, they could see it. A fleet of pirate ships descending fast, their weapons already charging up for another attack. Heavy assault drones began dropping onto the academy grounds, their metallic forms gleaming as they unfolded into combat positions. It wasn't a drill. For the first time, the instructors looked genuinely surprised. They had been prepared for anything except an actual attack. Commander Rix's voice cut through the noise. All recruits, fall back to the bunkers. This is not a drill. The instructors were moving, but the drones were already advancing, their weapons firing at any moving target. Chaos erupted. Some cadets followed. Orders running toward safety. Others panicked, frozen in place. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Get to cover!" he shouted, grabbing a cadet who was standing in shock and pulling him behind a barricade. The drones were fast, their weapons cutting through the academy's defenses. A group of Bracarian cadets tried to fight back, but their direct attacks did nothing against the reinforced armor of the machines. Ethan took in the situation quickly. The instructors were pinned down, too far to help. They had to act now, or they'd all be slaughtered. He grabbed a fallen energy rifle and turned to the others. "We're not waiting to be saved. We're fighting back." Some of the cadets hesitated. They were recruits, not soldiers. But Ethan's tone left no room for argument. "If we let them push through, we're done," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We have to hold this position." Vesk, still catching his breath from their earlier fight, stared at Ethan. He had spent the entire day mocking the human, but now, Ethan was the only one taking control. Vesk growled but stepped up. "Fine. What's the plan?" Ethan didn't waste time. "We bottleneck them. Drones are fast in open spaces, but they're useless if they're forced into tight areas. We lure them into the corridor near the supply station and ambush them." Vesk glanced at his squad. "You heard him. Move!" The cadets scrambled into position, using debris and barricades as cover. As the first wave of drones pushed forward, Ethan gave the order. "Now!" They opened fire, plasma rounds slamming into the exposed joints of the drones, short-circuiting their systems. The drones, caught in the tight corridor, couldn't maneuver properly. More explosions rocked the facility as the cadets fought back, now working together instead of panicking. The battle raged on, but the tide had turned. They weren't just surviving, they were winning. Then in the distance, Commander Rix watched everything unfold. From his position, he saw the cadets who should have been running in fear. Instead, they were holding the line, fighting back with actual strategy. And at the center of it all, the human. For the first time, Rix's expression softened, if only slightly. "Maybe," he muttered, watching Ethan move across the battlefield. "I underestimated them." The academy shook with another explosion, the red emergency lights flickering as smoke and fire spread through the training grounds. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and ozone as the pirate drones continued their assault, cutting through the academy's defenses with ruthless efficiency. Recruits scrambled for cover, some still too stunned to react, others blindly following the evacuation orders blaring through the intercoms. Ethan ducked behind a collapsed barricade, his hands gripping the plasma rifle he had taken from a fallen security officer. The weapon was heavier than he expected, the charge indicator glowing faintly as he checked the settings. Around him, the other recruits were huddled together, their expressions a mix of panic and uncertainty. "We need to get to the bunkers," one of the recruits muttered, his voice shaking. "If we move now, we'll be cut down," Ethan replied, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The drones were fast, too fast for anyone caught in the open. He watched as a group of cadets tried to make a run for the nearest tunnel, only for the drones to target them instantly. A bright streak of plasma arced through the air, and the ground exploded beneath their feet, sending them sprawling. Ethan clenched his jaw. They weren't going to make it out unless they fought back. "We have to hold this position," he said, looking around at the others. "If we let them keep pushing, they'll take out the main facility. The instructors are pinned down. It's up to us." The recruits hesitated. Most of them had never faced real combat before. Their training had been intense, but it was nothing like this. The enemy wasn't a simulation. The enemy was here, armed, and actively trying to kill them. Vesk, still breathing heavily from their earlier fight, let out a low growl. "And how exactly do you plan to stop them, human? We don't have the numbers or the firepower." Ethan pointed to the narrow corridor leading toward the supply station. "They're fast in the open, but they won't be as effective in tight spaces. If we can lure them in there, we can control the fight. We focus fire on the exposed joints. That's their weak spot." Vesk narrowed his eyes but didn't argue. He turned to his squad. "You heard him. Get into position." The others moved, their earlier hesitation replaced with determination. They didn't have a better plan, and Ethan's logic was sound. If they stayed in the open, they'd be picked off one by one. If they forced the fight into close quarters, they had a chance. Ethan pressed himself against the wall as the first wave of drones moved in, their sleek metallic bodies gliding over the debris. Their targeting sensor glowed red, scanning the area for movement. He waited, his breath steady, his grip firm. "Now!" he shouted. The recruits opened fire at once, the plasma bolts streaking through the corridor. The drones reacted instantly, their weapons charging up, but the confined space limited their mobility. Ethan's first shot struck one of the drones in the joint between his torso and leg. The machine spasmed, its circuits overloading before collapsing to the ground. Vesk and his squad fired in unison, their coordinated attack forcing the drones to retreat slightly. The tactic was working. The recruits were hitting their targets, forcing the enemy back. Ethan kept moving, ducking behind cover between shots, his mind focused only on the fight. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He had trained for this. He had imagined scenarios like this back home, running drills, analyzing tactics. But now it was real, and somehow he wasn't afraid. More drones pushed forward, adjusting to the new attack pattern. One of them locked onto Ethan's position, its weapon charging up. He threw himself to the side just as a plasma bolt scorched the air where he had been standing. The heat seared his arm, but he ignored the pain, rolling back to his feet and taking another shot. The drone went down, sparks flying from its chassis. "We need heavier firepower," one of the recruits called out, ducking as another blast hit the wall beside him. "The armory is across the courtyard," Vesk said, "but it's wide open." Ethan's mind raced. The armory held weapons that could turn the tide, but getting there was risky. The drones were still controlling the main approach, their firepower too overwhelming for a straight charge. "There's another way," Ethan said, glancing at the ventilation shafts lining the upper walls. "We send a small group through the side tunnels. They come up near the armory, grab what they can, and hit the drones from behind." Vesk frowned. "And if they get caught?" "They won't," Ethan said, "because we'll create a distraction." Vesk stared at him for a long moment before nodding. He turned to two of his fastest recruits. "You're going. Get in, grab whatever heavy weapons you can, and get back here alive." The two nodded before disappearing into the side tunnels. Ethan took a deep breath and stood up. "All right, let's give them something to focus on." The recruits opened fire again, this time with more aggression. They moved forward, forcing the drones to concentrate their attacks on the main group. The enemy adjusted, returning fire with precision, but the recruits kept them occupied. Minutes passed, each second feeling like an eternity. Then suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos, a deep, mechanical hum. The recruits turned just in time to see the first anti-armor plasma launcher fire from the armory. The explosion tore through the front line of drones, sending debris flying in every direction. The recruits who had gone for weapons emerged, carrying pulse grenades, high-caliber plasma rifles, and explosive charges. "Now we're talking," Vesk muttered, grabbing one of the heavy weapons. Ethan didn't waste time. "Push forward!" The counterattack was swift and brutal. The recruits moved as a unit, using their newfound firepower to tear through the remaining drones. Plasma bolts filled the air, explosions shaking the battlefield as the tide shifted in their favor. The last of the drones fell, their circuits fried, their metallic bodies scattered across the training grounds. Then finally silence. The battle was over. Ethan exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. Around him, the recruits stood, some gasping for breath, others staring at the destruction around them. They had done it. Footsteps echoed through the clearing as Commander Rix approached, his reptilian eyes scanning the scene. His expression was unreadable, but there was something different in his gaze, something that hadn't been there before. He stopped in front of Ethan, studying him carefully. "You disobeyed direct orders," Rix said, his voice low. Ethan straightened. "Yes, sir." Rix tilted his head slightly. "And yet, you saved this academy from falling." Ethan didn't respond. The commander let out a slow exhale before turning to the rest of the recruits. "You fought well," he said. "Better than expected." His eyes flickered back to Ethan. "Especially you." Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. For the first time since arriving at the academy, the human had earned the respect of a warrior. The training ground was quiet, the battlefield still littered with the remains of the pirate drones. The recruits stood in silence, their bodies aching, adrenaline still running through their veins. The air was thick with the scent of burned metal and scorched earth. The emergency alarms had stopped, replaced by the hum of recovery drones cleaning up the wreckage. The battle was over, but the tension still lingered. Commander Rix stood with his arms crossed, his reptilian eyes, scanning the field. He had seen countless battles, fought against warriors of every kind, but nothing had prepared him for what he had just witnessed. He had doubted the human from the moment he stepped foot in the academy, but now he wasn't sure what to think. "Ethan Carter," Rix said, his voice calm but firm. Ethan turned, his uniform torn, his face smudged with dirt and sweat. He stood at attention, back straight, eyes forward. He had expected consequences for disobeying orders, for leading a group of recruits into battle instead of retreating. He was ready for whatever punishment Rix had in mind. The commander studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I have fought warriors from 100 worlds, stronger, faster, deadlier than you, and yet none have adapted as quickly as you." Ethan held his ground. He had heard this before, the constant reminder that humans were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most advanced, but that was never what made them dangerous. "That's because humans don't rely on brute force," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We rely on our minds. We adapt, improvise, and survive." Rix said nothing at first. His golden eyes flickered with something unreadable, something close to amusement, perhaps even respect. He had underestimated Ethan, just as the rest of the recruits had. He had expected the human to fail, to struggle, to fall behind. But instead, Ethan had led a team of untested cadets, held the line against an unexpected enemy, and turned the tide of battle. Rix gave a slow nod. It would seem so. The other recruits stood nearby, watching the exchange in silence. Vesk, the Brakurian warrior who had once mocked Ethan, now stood with his arms crossed, saying nothing. Some of the others who had doubted him looked away, unwilling to admit they had been wrong. A few, however, nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Ethan had earned their respect, even if they wouldn't say it out loud. Rix took a step forward. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said, his voice lowering. "You put yourself and your fellow cadets in danger." Ethan didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." Rix let the silence stretch, watching him carefully. Then after a long pause, his mouth curled into something that almost resembled a grin. "And you saved this academy in the process?" Ethan let out a slow breath. He hadn't expected praise, but he would take it. Rix turned to the rest of the recruits. "You all fought well today. You proved yourselves in a way that no training exercise ever could. The enemy was real. The threat was real. And you survived." He let his gaze sweep over them. "But do not mistake survival for victory. You were lucky today. Luck does not win wars. Training does. Discipline does." The recruits nodded in understanding. The fight had been a test, and while they had passed, the real battles were still ahead. "Training resumes tomorrow," Rix said. "Dismissed." The recruits broke formation, murmuring amongst themselves as they made their way back toward the barracks. Ethan exhaled, letting the tension in his shoulders ease. He had expected punishment, maybe even expulsion, but instead he had walked away with something far more valuable. Recognition. As he turned to leave, Vesk fell into step beside him. You got lucky, the Bricarian muttered. Ethan smirked. Maybe. Vess glanced at him before shaking his head. Or maybe you actually know what you're doing. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. The Academy's main hall was filled with recruits, some celebrating, others reflecting on what had happened. The attack had changed everything. The training was no longer just preparation for some distant battle. It was real. The war was already here. Later that evening, the graduation ceremony was held. It wasn't the ceremony they had expected, not after everything that had happened, but it was still a moment of recognition. Each recruit was called forward, given their official insignia, marking them as soldiers in the Galactic military. Ethan stood among them, his heart pounding as his name was called. He stepped forward, standing before the high-ranking officers. Commander Rix placed the insignia in his hand, meeting his gaze with something close to approval. "You have earned this," Rix said. "You have earned your place here." Ethan nodded, gripping the insignia tightly. One by one, the recruits were called, receiving their insignias, their ranks. Some looked at Ethan with newfound respect, others with lingering resentment. Not everyone was ready to accept that a human had risen to the top. As the ceremony came to an end, Ethan found himself standing on the edge of the observation deck, looking out at the vast expanse of space beyond the Academy. The stars stretched endlessly before him, each one a reminder of how much more there was to come. He had proven himself here, but this was just the beginning. There were more battles ahead, more challenges waiting. A soft hum filled the air as a figure approached. Rick stopped beside him, staring out at the stars as well. "You surprised me, Carter," the commander admitted. Ethan smirked. "You're not the first to say that." Rix let out a quiet chuckle before his expression hardened. "This is only the start. If you continue down this path, you will face enemies far worse than today. You will see war in ways you never imagined." Ethan nodded. "I know." Rick studied him for a long moment. "I hope you're ready." Ethan looked back at the stars, his jaw set with quiet determination. "I guess we'll find out." Rix gave a final nod before walking away, leaving Ethan alone with the endless sky. The future awaited, and for the first time, the galaxy would learn what humanity was truly capable of.